Thank you for joining us at the Center for Japanese Studies noon lecture today. My name is Yuki Shiraido, Assistant Professor of Political Science and a member of CJS, and I am the host today. Before introducing today's speaker, let me make an announcement from CJS. In 2 weeks, Thursday, November 5th, 2020, our next CJS noon lecture will be given by Charlotte Eubanks, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Asian Studies at Penn State, on Voice as Talisman, Theorizing Sound in Medieval Japanese Treatise on Sutra Chanting. Please check out the UMCJS event page as to how to sign up. Okay, now let me introduce Professor Amy Catalinac, the Department of the Department of Politics at New York University. Professor Catalinac received her PhD from Harvard University in 2011. Since then, she taught Australian National University, Harvard University, and she moved to New York University in 2015. She studies comparative politics with a particular focus on Japan, and she is one of the leading political scientists specialized in Japan. In particular, she has done pioneering work applying statistical text analysis methods to the study of the Japanese politics. She published her work in journals such as Comparative Political Studies, American Political Science Review, and the Journal of Politics, all of which are top academic journals in political science. Her monograph, Electoral Reform and National Security in Japan, From Polk to Foreign Policy, was published in 2016. It addresses the change in the behavior of politicians in Japan after the electoral reform in the 1990s, where they started paying more attention to national security than pork barrel politics. But today, she is going to talk about how pork barrel politics holds the Liberal Democratic Party and the Komeito for such a long time. Now it's probably about for 20 years. In this webinar, attendee webcams and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to use the Q&A function, not the chat function, to submit any questions you have. You can submit your questions anytime, and after Professor Catalinac's presentation, I will ask her your questions. Okay, so with all that, Amy, please go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you so much for that very nice introduction, Yuki, and thank you more broadly to the Center for Japanese Studies at the University of Michigan, and for all of you who tirelessly worked to reschedule my talk and make it into the Zoom webinar that it's going to be today. So I'm really happy to be here. To be virtually here. So the title of my talk today is How Pork Barrel Politics Holds Japan's Governing Coalition Together. So I want to begin today's talk by talking a little bit. I hope everything's fine with being able to view the screen here. So I'm just going to make sure everything's fine. Okay, great, thank you. So let's begin with the puzzle that motivated this research. So the puzzle is as follows. So since 1955, Japanese politics has been dominated by the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. Now, anyone who is familiar with Japan, even if you're not familiar with Japanese politics, knows that the LDP is very dominant. So it's sort of hard to understate how dominant the LDP is. So the LDP has won plurality, which means it's emerged as the largest party in 20 of the past 21 House of Representatives elections. So that means because the House of Representatives is the lower house, it selects the government, it chooses the prime minister. This means that the LDP has been in charge of government in Japan the third largest economy in the world for 61 of the past 65 years. So this is an extraordinary record for a democracy, and it's led my colleagues to describe the LDP as the most successful political party in a democracy around the world today. So in 13 of the past 21 elections, it's actually won over 50% of seats, which is incredible. And in the first 3 elections that it ever fought, and in 4 of the more recent elections, the LDP managed over 60% of seats in House of Representatives elections. So it is very, very dominant. Since 1999, the LDP has been governing in tandem with another party, a small party called the Komeito. So this is 21 years going on now, the relationship the LDP has had with the Komeito. Now this relationship is a puzzle. Why? The two parties are very ideologically opposed to each other. So the LDP, just for those of you who are less familiar, is a conservative nationalist party. It was founded in 1955 with the goal of revising Japan's pacifist constitution, in general unshackling Japan from Allied occupation era reforms, and embarking on a more independent national security policy. So they have held their commitment to these principles, you could say, has sort of wavered over time, but this is their founding principles. 1964, the Komeito was formed. The Komeito is formed on the principles of pacifism, social welfare, and what's called humanistic socialism. So the Komeito opposes constitutional revision. It opposes an independent security policy for Japan. The two parties are very ideologically incompatible. Moreover, they have a very long history of considerable antagonism. So the Komeito boasts the sort of distinction as being one of the, I think usually it's the least liked party, or it was for many years in surveys of Japanese voters. LDP candidates used to run their campaigns on the enemy is Komeito. So they have a long history of antagonism and are ideologically incompatible. When they formed the coalition in 1999, the LDP needed the seats provided by the Komeito. So the LDP didn't have enough seats in the lower house. However, since then, it has won 4 elections that have given it, it's won other elections which did not give it what I'm about to say, but it's won 4 elections since forming the coalition with the Komeito that have given it over 60% of seats, and yet it still has this relationship with the Komeito. Why? So this is a sort of puzzle that drives this research project. So what do we want to know? And here are just some nice pictures of Yamaguchi, the head of the Komeito, and Abe, and now Suga down the bottom. So what we want to know is, why are the two parties so tight? What is each partner getting from the coalition? So this is like a lot of sort of going back and forth with the parties. The Komeito is saying, no, we actually want this, the LDP. There's a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of policies being made, and we want to know like which of those policies reflects each of these partners' preferences. We also want to know what role the coalition has played in perpetuating the LDP's dominance. Now, I would say it's troubling that democratic Japan is, in many senses of the word, a single party state. And I want to know more about why that is. And then fourthly, because I'm a political scientist and I use Japan as a lens to understand sort of general principles about how political systems work that could be applied more broadly, I want to know what the takeaways are for other countries. So in today's talk, I'm going to do sort of 3 main things. So the first thing is I'm going to explain how Japan's electoral system gives the LDP incentives to engage in what's called pre-electoral coordination with the Komeito. And then they also have incentives to cement this pre-electoral coordination with geographically targeted spending. Now I'm going to explain these terms, more simple than they may seem. I'm going to explain these terms in a minute. And then I'm going to present compelling new evidence from Japan's House of Representatives elections. We look at 3 elections that this is going on. So they are using pre-electoral coordination, and then they are cementing, solidifying that coordination with government spending. And then I'm going to discuss the implications of this for our understandings of LDP dominance, of intra-coalition politics, and other puzzles pertaining to Japanese politics. And then I'm going to conclude with a lot of like, what's next, where I plan to take this research project. The research I'm presenting today is drawn from co-authored work with Lucia Motolinia, who's a PhD candidate in my department at NYU Politics, a fantastic PhD candidate. Together, we've written this paper, which looks at Japan and also Mexico. I won't be talking about Mexico today, but I am happy to talk about Mexico. And we plan to write a book, and the book is going to focus on Japan, Mexico, and other cases of MMM. Sorry, MMM is the electoral system that Japan uses, which I'm going to be describing in a minute. Okay, so let's get started. So Japan's House of Representatives. First of all, why are we looking at the House of Representatives? This is the lower house in Japan. So we're looking at the lower house because the lower house has more power than the upper house. So the lower house, there's two houses. The lower house gets to pick the prime minister. It gets to pass the budget. It gets to have the final say over legislation under certain conditions. And it gets to form foreign treaties with other powers. So it's very important. Whoever controls the House of Representatives typically controls the government. Well, has always controlled the government. Since 1996, Japan's House of Representatives has used what's called a mixed member electoral system. Okay, so in the United States, this may not be very familiar with those of you most familiar with the United States, but 38 countries around the world today used what's called a mixed member system to select members of their lower houses. And there's more if you also consider their upper houses. So by our calculations, this means 33% of voters worldwide are selecting their legislators under a mixed member electoral system. So what's a mixed member system? So mixed member systems have two tiers, essentially just two systems. So there's a district tier and a proportional tier, usually, most cases. So in a district tier, so by district, it's usually what we call a single seat district, like we have in the United States. I'm just going to call these throughout the presentation SSDs. So what SSDs are is you select a candidate. You vote for the candidate you want to represent your local district. The proportional tier is where you vote for a party. So in the proportional tier, parties compete for a number of seats. They offer lists of candidates, and you vote for whichever party list you like. So in most mixed member systems, you're voting for a candidate in a district tier and a party in a proportional tier. And in most of these systems, you actually have two votes, but not in every system. So some systems you have a single fused vote. So of these 38 countries, there are two main types of mixed member system. So Japan's type is called mixed member majoritarian, and this is called MMM. Sorry for all the jargon, but I'm going to use the words MMM. And that just refers to Japan's electoral system, which is called mixed member majoritarian. So this is by far the most common variant of electoral system. So out of the 38 countries that used mixed systems, 30 of them are using MMM. And this is very common among Asian democracies. So there's South Korea, there's Taiwan, there's Thailand, there's other countries in Japan's region that have also chosen mixed member majoritarian. Okay, so in mixed member majoritarian systems, voters cast votes for a candidate in the SSD race and a party in the PR race. So they have two ballots. Okay. Now, critically, a really important thing to know about this system, which makes it different from the other type of mixed member system that many comparative politics scholars are most familiar with, MMP, is that under mixed member majoritarian, the number of seats a party wins is the sum of the seats it wins in both tiers. So under this other type of system that I'm not going to talk about, but which we have research about, mixed member proportional, under that system, the total number of seats a party wins is a product of the number it wins in PR and the PR tier only. So parties don't have to win districts in mixed member proportional. But in mixed member majoritarian, the system that Japan uses, any party that wants a majority of seats necessary to control government has to win a majority of these. Well, it has to win as many SSDs as possible. It can't ignore the SSDs. It has to focus on the SSDs. It has to focus on winning as many SSDs as possible. So what I'm going to say in this slide is very familiar to political scientists, but maybe less familiar to non-political scientists. I've called this slide the fundamentals. So I want to explain what happens when you have what political competition looks like when you have an SSD. So in a single seat district, and we have them in the United States too, so I'm sure you're all familiar with them, the candidate capturing the most votes wins the seat. And that means all of the votes cast for losing candidates are wasted. So what the type of competition this engenders is between two serious competitors. So when you have, in the United States, you have a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate in each single seat district. And there's sort of various factors usually that cause this. Typically, it's the idea that one main idea is that voters don't want their votes to be wasted, so they're not going to vote for a small party candidate that doesn't have a good chance of winning. So because all voters think like this, competition is going to coalesce around two serious candidates. So in an SSD, small parties are going to struggle to place first. So if you're a small party, you could have 20% of support across the entire country, but because 20% of support is sort of evenly distributed, and you can't win an SSD, you can't win a district with 20% of support, you're not going to be able to place first in many SSDs, even if you are actually potentially a viable political force. So SSDs engender competition between two serious candidates. So then, what does competition look like in the PR tier? So in proportional representation, it's quite different. The number of seats a party wins increases with its vote share. So if you win 20% of votes, you get 20% of the seats, more or less. If you win 70% of the votes, you get 70% of the seats, more or less. So there's no threshold after which votes for the losing parties are wasted. So you just get the proportion of votes that you get with your seat share. So in the proportional representation tier, both large and small parties are viable. You can have a large party, you can have a small party, more or less. Whereas with SSDs, you're going to just have two large parties. That's the idea here. So I want to switch tack and talk about what's called pre-electoral coordination. Now this is, frankly, I want to kind of come up with a better term to describe what it is. So what pre-electoral coordination is it's agreements not to compete against each other. So two parties get together and coordinate. That means agree not to compete here and here and here, etc. So the point that we make in this project is that under MMM, large parties have reason to coordinate with smaller parties. And I want to explain why that is. So the LDP, I guess I'll use the LDP as an example. So the large party needs to place first in a majority of SSDs. So in Japan, there were 300 when the electoral system was first introduced in 1996, 300 SSDs. So the large party is like, oh, I have to place first in as many SSDs as possible. This is really difficult, especially because a lot of my candidates aren't very strong, right? So I didn't want to embarrass particular Japanese politicians by putting their faces up here. But when the electoral system was reformed in 1994 and the new system was introduced in 1996, the LDP was like, I don't know, we don't have enough candidates that can place first. And that's because Japan used a different electoral system before in which candidates didn't have to place first. So now they have to place first. So the large party is like, our candidates are not always strong enough. So what the large party thinks is it thinks in those SSDs where its candidates are weak, they could ask a small party, if a small party exists, they could ask the small party to stand down and ask its supporters to vote for the large party's candidate. Okay, so if they do that, then their large party candidate has a higher chance of winning the SSD because they can get the votes of the small party candidate. So under MMM, remember that small parties exist under MMM because of the PR tier. So these small parties are not really going to place first in many SSDs, but they exist because of the PR tier. They're viable because of the PR tier. So in MMM, the large party can be like, okay, I want your votes for my candidate in the SSD. What can I give you in return? I can ask my supporters to vote for you in PR in exchange for getting your votes for my candidate. So this is why under MMM, pre-electoral coordination is desirable from the perspective of the large party, and it's also possible because these small parties exist and these bargains can be made. So both parties can win more seats than they otherwise would. Okay, and this is other people have have said this. This is not a claim that's unique to our study. Concretely, how does this work in Japan? So this is how it works in Japan. The LDP and the Komeito got together in coalition in 1999. So over time, and it didn't take very long for them to figure out that this was a good way of doing things. What they decided to do is they decided to divvy up all the SSDs. There were 300 SSDs originally. This has been decreased now to 289. So they divvy up all the SSDs and they decide, so there's going to be LDP SSDs and Komeito SSDs. So let's just consider the LDP SSDs. So these are districts where the LDP has been designated the district, so it runs a candidate, and the Komeito candidate stands down. And this is the vast majority of SSDs. This makes sense because in a single seat district, you have to place first, so the large party is going to be more viable there. So typically, about 90% of the SSDs are given to the LDP. So the LDP runs a candidate, the Komeito stands down. The Komeito supporters are asked to cast their district votes for the LDP candidate, and the LDP candidate is asked to cast, that LDP supporters are asked to cast their PR votes for the Komeito. So this is what they're doing in LDP SSDs. So in LDP SSDs, the LDP supporters are voting for the LDP's SSD candidate and the Komeito in PR, and the Komeito supporters are voting for the LDP candidate in the SSD and their own party in PR. So this is what's going on in LDP SSDs. The reverse happens in Komeito SSDs. So Komeito SSDs, very small percentage, only 3% of SSDs are designated Komeito SSDs. So the Komeito candidate runs and the LDP candidate stands down. So in these SSDs, LDP supporters are asked to cast their SSD votes for the Komeito candidate, and Komeito supporters are asked to cast their PR votes for the LDP. So in exchange, just going back to LDP SSDs, in exchange for standing down, the Komeito gets PR votes. And the second point, in the Komeito SSDs, in exchange for standing down, the LDP gets PR votes. Okay, so this deal means that the LDP wins more SSDs than it would without the Komeito support, and the Komeito wins more PR seats than they otherwise would without the extra votes provided by LDP supporters. Okay, so up until now, these points are sort of made by other scholars, although there's been no work on the Komeito SSDs, but these points have been made by other scholars. Now, where we come in is we say that geographically targeted spending may be being used here to encourage this coordination of votes. So there's a very large literature in political science on how governing parties can use geographically targeted spending to increase their chances of staying in office. So what I mean by geographically targeted spending are resources that the government controls, like subsidies, grants, transfers for particular projects, and money like that. Now that money is controlled by the government, and the opposition typically has no access to it. Sadly, perhaps sadly, normatively from the perspective of democracy, governing parties do this all the time. And there's a large literature that shows how they use these monies in different electoral systems to enhance their chances of winning the next election. So my co-author and I sat down and we thought, could governing parties be using this money to encourage supporters to help them coordinate? So we talk about in the paper, we talk about compliance. So could the governing party be like promising money to supporters who comply and then withholding money from supporters who don't comply? So this is sort of what we're interested in testing. Now, from the perspective of a governing party or a governing party's candidate in an SSD, you don't know if an individual is complying, right? You don't know if the individual in an LDP SSD is voting for the LDP's candidate and then casting the PR vote for the Komeito like they're supposed to, because we have the secret ballot. So democracies have the secret ballot. We can't observe how individuals vote. Thinking about this a little harder, however, and I've got a lot of research in this area right now. So votes in most countries are actually counted at a geographic unit within each sort of district, each electoral district. So in many countries, it's the polling station. In my own country, I'm from New Zealand, polling station level sort of votes are available. And so my mother lives in a very, very small area. And I think there's only like 130 votes being counted in this area. So this is sort of amazing, actually, how fine-grained where votes are counted and vote totals are available. So the sort of insight we had is that when votes are counted in a geographic unit within each district, the governing party can observe how this unit votes, the share of votes to each parties in this geographically defined unit. So our insight is to say that the governing party can use changes in vote share over time to discern whether that unit is complying or not. So they can say PR votes for the LDP going down, PR votes for the Komeito going up. Yes, okay, good. That means they're complying. And to the extent to which they have geographically targetable funds at their disposal, if they have funds that they can target at those different units, and it's interesting to think about because if votes are being counted at a polling station level, typically governments don't have like money they can target to a polling station, right? But if the votes are counted at a municipality level, often governments do have money that they can target to different municipalities. So the idea here is that they can reward compliance with geographically targetable funds. Okay, concretely, what does this look like in the case of Japan? So in Japan, there's sort of the administrative structure is there's the central government, there's 47 prefectures, and then there's about 3,300 municipalities. So municipalities are the sort of lowest level, and these can be cities, towns, special wards, or villages. So during the period of study, I should say that there were also municipal mergers, so the number of municipalities dropped significantly. But the point is that in Japan, municipalities depend on the central government for a lot of the revenue. About 60% of the revenue needed to perform the basic services are required of them by law. So every year, there's a couple of different ways in which the government gives municipalities money. One way is through something called local allocation tax, which is a formula-based grant that I'm not looking at in this study. The second way is the government makes this huge sum of money available for municipalities to apply for. So this sum of money is called National Treasury Disbursements. I call it NTD in this presentation. It's kokko shishitsuken in Japanese. So they make a lot of money available. Municipalities have to apply for these funds. Helpfully, in Japanese elections, votes are counted at the level of the municipality. And other research that I'm working on and have worked on show how this discretionary transfer that's awarded by central government bureaucrats to municipalities is used to reward electoral performance in other ways. So there's a lot of research that shows that NTD is used politically. So we hypothesize that it is used to cement this pre-electoral coordination, these deals between the LDP and the Komeito. So there's two hypotheses we test in the project. Well, there are other hypotheses that we look at with the case of Mexico, but today I'm just going to talk about the Japan hypotheses. So what we hypothesize is that in LDP SSDs, so these are SSDs where the LDP candidate is running and the Komeito candidate has stood down. So we think that these municipalities are going to receive more money after elections when they increase PR votes for the Komeito and decrease them for the LDP. So that would be evidence that LDP supporters are switching their PR votes to the Komeito, and that is in return for getting the Komeito supporters to vote for the LDP's SSD candidate. Municipalities in Komeito SSDs, on the other hand, they receive more money after elections when they increase PR votes for the LDP and decrease them for the Komeito. Because in Komeito SSDs, the LDP candidate is standing down. So they're like, we really need those PR votes. So in Komeito SSDs, Komeito supporters, they should be voting for the Komeito SSD candidate, but in PR, they should not be voting for the Komeito in PR, they should be switching their votes to the LDP in PR. So these are the hypotheses that we're testing in the paper. So I'm going to explain just a little bit about the empirical strategy. And I understand it may not be the most interesting for some of you, but it is quite interesting to political scientists. So what we do is we collect a lot of data on the number. So we collect a lot of data on Japanese municipalities. I've collected this data from 1980 till recently, to about, I think I have it until 2013. So we collect all of this data on their voting behavior and on the amount of money that they get from the government every year. And we also have all of these other variables pertaining to their populations, their average income, their fiscal strength, a lot of other variables. So what we do is we conduct what's called a two-way fixed effect regression, and I'll explain what that means. On this NTD transfer, the year following 3 HOR elections when this coordination is known to have taken place, 2003, 2005, 2012. We don't focus on the 2009 election because the LDP Komeito lost that election. So the coordination did not work in that election. That's also something I want to figure out a little bit later on. Okay, so in this regression, so the dependent variable in the regression is per capita transfers the year after the election. We want to explain what is driving per capita transfers after the election for all of these different municipalities. And there's variation in this. We want to explain this variation. So we have 3 variables that we're interested in. So delta Komeito PR vote share. This measures the change in share of eligible voters voting Komeito in PR from the previous election. So this is sort of like, so this higher numbers on this variable means greater increases in PR votes for the Komeito. And then we have the same variable for the LDP multiplied by -1. So what this means is we take the change in share of eligible voters voting for the LDP and PR from the previous election. So this could be, say, 10% would mean like an increase, like the PR vote share for the LDP increased by 10%, and then we minus it. We times it by -1. So on this variable, higher numbers on this variable indicate greater decreases in votes for the LDP in PR in that municipality. And this is a little bit complicated, but we really thought very hard about how to measure this, and this is the best way that we came up with. So what we are interested in and what's called the interaction between these 2 variables. So the interaction here, and that's denoted by the star in the middle here, delta Komeito PR vote share interacted with negative delta LDP PR vote share. That is going to capture the effect of a municipality that increased PR votes for the Komeito and decreased them for the LDP. So we expect that the effect of this variable on transfers is going to be positive and statistically significant in the LDP SSD. So in LDP SSDs, we expect that municipalities where PR votes for the Komeito increased and municipalities where PR votes for the LDP decreased, when that happens in the same municipality, that's the municipalities that should be getting a lot more money. And that's because they're complying with the coordination strategy. We expect the opposite in Komeito SSDs. So in Komeito SSDs, where the Komeito candidate is running, LDP supporters are supporting, the LDP candidate has stood down and LDP supporters are voting for the Komeito's candidate. Here we expect places that increase PR votes for the Komeito and decrease them for the LDP will be penalized with less money, because that's not what they should be doing. In Komeito SSDs, we should observe Komeito supporters voting more for the LDP and PR. We should observe decreases in PR votes for the Komeito and places that decrease votes for the Komeito and increase votes for the LDP, they should be getting rewarded in Komeito SSDs. So I'm going to kind of walk you through that again, because I know it can be a little hard to get your head around. So in this regression, we also want to control for like a lot of other things that we think could be going on. Okay, so what we include in this regression is something called an SSD year fixed effect. So that controls for all of the ways in which each individual district in an election might be different from each other, right? So some districts may have a senior politician representing them. Other districts may have someone with a particular set of connections, maybe a former bureaucrat representing them. We have a lot of other research, Japanese politics, that shows that the amount of money, the amount of NTD, in fact, actually varies across districts substantially. So we want to control for all of those features that might be influencing it might be sort of driving any of the results that we find on the interaction that we're interested in. So what this means, when you include an SSD year fixed effect, it means that you're effectively comparing municipalities within the same district year. So you're only looking at municipalities with regard to other municipalities in the same district. We also include what's called a municipality fixed effect and municipality level controls. So what this means is we are controlling for all of the different ways in which municipalities themselves might be different from each other. So to get this money as a municipality, you have to apply to the central government, you have to present them with an idea, a proposal for a project, and the central government says yes or no and funds the project. So some municipalities might be really good at putting together proposals, other municipalities might not be so good at putting together proposals. So in this regression, we want to control for all the ways in which municipalities might be different from each other. Municipalities also experience changes over time and how good they are, right? They might hire a new lobbyist, and that new lobbyist is really good at putting together proposals. So we want to control for other differences in the municipalities. We call them time varying municipality level control. So for example, like there could be a shock, there could be an earthquake, there could be an income shock in a given year, positive or negative. So we include a whole set of controls at the municipality level so we can kind of make sure that any changes in the municipality's income or population or proportion of elderly people, we want to make sure that they are not driving our results. We also control for transfers the year of the election. So this is what's called the lagged dependent variable. So we want to make sure that it's the coordination in the election that drives the amount of money you get after the election. So by including transfers the year of the election, we're helping to kind of isolate the effect of coordination in the election. This sort of minimizes the possibility that there's something about the municipality, there's a variable X about the municipality that causes it to both have high compliance and get more money after the election. So including the lag dependent variable helps mitigate against that. And then we also know that we also want to control for the number of votes that the coalition's SSD candidate is winning, possible changes in that. So like if an LDP SSD has a candidate who's not very strong retire and gets another candidate, and maybe that candidate's really popular, we want to make sure that our results are actually not driven by changes in support for the coalition's SSD candidate. We want to make sure it's actually about the coordination, this interactive variable here. So that's why we control for changes in votes for the coalition's SSD candidate. Okay, so I'm going to show you the results of a regression. And what I want you to look at is this top line. So here we have delta Komeito PR vote share interacted with the negative delta LDP PR vote share. And as you can see, this has a positive, significant effect on transfers in all of the different models. So the models vary a little bit. The latter two models include the changes in support for the LDP's SSD candidate. The first two models don't. So critically, what this shows is if you look within SSD years for these three elections, it means that municipalities that experienced increases in votes for the Komeito in PR and decreases in votes for the LDP got more money after the election. So this, I should also say, this is in LDP SSD. So we are only looking at LDP SSDs here. Now, so these are districts, just to remind you, these are districts where the LDP candidate is running, the Komeito candidate has stood down. So the LDP candidate is running, Komeito candidate stands down. So here we expect places that increase PR votes for the Komeito and decrease them for the LDP are getting more money. That is evidence that LDP supporters have stopped casting their PR votes for the LDP and are switching them to the Komeito. And this is what we find. These results are very robust to these specifications that I just explained. So this is a marginal, what's called a marginal effects plot. So in a marginal effects plot, this is just the expected change in the dependent variable, which is transfers over here on the y-axis. The expected change in transfers as values of negative delta LDP PR vote share increase at different levels of the delta Komeito vote share. So if you look at the black dotted line here, so remember that negative delta LDP PR vote share, that is, so greater increase, so higher numbers mean fewer votes for the LDP. So as votes for the LDP decrease in places where votes for the Komeito increase, the black dotted line, you get more money after the election. So we also calculated average marginal effect, but yeah, maybe I'll leave that and push on. But the point is you get more money in LDP SSDs if you increase PR votes for the Komeito and decrease them for the LDP. So if you increase votes for the Komeito and increase votes for the LDP, you get less money. The opposite is true in Komeito SSDs. So here we've got the Komeito SSD. This is a result for this very small number of SSDs where Komeito candidates run. It's a very small number of SSDs. In fact, we only have 63 observations in this regression. So this is a powerful, like a large effect. So in Komeito SSDs, the opposite is true. In Komeito SSDs, the LDP wants Komeito supporters to vote for them in PR. So places where Komeito PR votes increase, LDP PR votes decrease, get punished. They get penalized with less money after the election. So the flip side of that is that the opposite is that we could operationalize the variables in a slightly different way, but what that means is that places that decrease PR votes for the Komeito and increase them for the LDP are rewarded. Okay, so, and this is a very strong result given our specifications. Okay, and we also have the same marginal effects plot. So in LDP SSDs, if you look at the solid black dotted line, increases in in LDP SSDs, decreases in votes for the LDP, decreases in PR votes for the LDP, and increases in PR votes for the Komeito are rewarded. But in Komeito SSDs, that's punished. So in Komeito SSDs, decreases in votes for the LDP at high levels of Komeito votes in places where the Komeito PR votes have increased and the LDP PR votes have decreased, that's punished in Komeito SSD. So the reverse is true there, and that's exactly what we would expect from the perspective of coordination. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I say I'm going to wrap up. There's a few slides before I actually wrap up, so please bear with me. So let me just go over what we've learned in this talk and with this paper. So what we've learned is Japan's governing coalition uses pork barrel politics to help it win elections. So in LDP SSDs, where the Komeito candidates are standing down, money is used to convince LDP supporters to switch their PR votes to the Komeito. In Komeito SSDs, where LDP candidates have stood down, money is used to convince Komeito supporters to switch their PR votes to the LDP. Okay, so these are the headline results, which I've just shown you. We can also look a little bit deeper at the uninteracted independent variables, which I sort of touched on before. So we can look at what are the effects of delta Komeito PR vote share and the negative delta LDP PR vote share when they're not interacted. So there are some other findings here that are of interest that I'm also happy to discuss. So in LDP SSDs, what we find is money. So in LDP SSDs, right, the Komeito candidate is standing down. So the Komeito candidate is standing down. They want a lot of PR votes. But what we find is money is not used to convince Komeito supporters to cast more PR votes for the Komeito. So money is only used to convince LDP supporters to switch their votes. And we know this because in LDP SSDs, places that just experience an increase in Komeito PR votes without the corresponding decrease in LDP PR votes are not rewarded with more money after the election. So money is not targeted at Komeito supporters and LDP SSDs. In Komeito SSDs, we find, however, that money is used to convince LDP supporters to cast more PR votes for the LDP. So in Komeito SSDs, money is geared toward convincing LDP supporters to vote more for the LDP and PR, and also it's directed at Komeito supporters to switch their PR votes for the LDP. So LDP supporters are getting more money, they're getting incentivized to vote in particular ways in all types of SSDs, but Komeito supporters are only getting sort of money for switching their votes to the LDP in the Komeito SSDs, but the amount of money they're getting is large. Okay, so this is what we've learned through the statistical analysis that I presented. So what are the takeaways for Japan scholars? So a really big takeaway is that the LDP is not as strong as it looks. So looking at the seat shares, the number of seats that both parties are contributing to the sort of governing majority. So the Komeito has a much smaller share of the coalition seats than the LDP. Overall, the Komeito has only 9 to 11% of seats in the lower house as a whole. But what our findings indicate, and other people have said as well, is that many LDP SSD candidates, they simply would not be getting elected without those Komeito votes. So the LDP, all of their candidates need Komeito votes. I shouldn't say every single one, because some LDP candidates are very strong, like Koizumi Shinjiro, for example. I don't actually know about his, whether he gets Komeito votes or not. I'm just using him as an example. There are some LDP candidates that are just really strong. So maybe they don't depend on the Komeito votes as much. But for Japan scholars, political scientists, we shouldn't rely on the number of SSDs or the number of PR votes won by any party really that's engaging in pre-electoral coordination as a gauge of how strong that party is. So votes in both tiers, in the SSD tier and in the PR tier, electoral system scholars would say that those votes are contaminated. We use the word contaminated, are contaminated by other parties' votes. So it looks like the LDP is strong, but actually they're getting all the votes of the Komeito, and the LDP PR vote is not a very reliable indicator of how much support the LDP actually has, because some of those PR votes are going to the Komeito, etc. So what another takeaway is that this electoral system that I explained before, called MMM, mixed member majoritarian, the combination of that and this access to geographically targeted spending, this enables the LDP to use the Komeito as a crutch to win more SSDs, which is critical for forming a majority. So what we think this project offers, and we would like to spell this out in more detail in future work, is it offers a new explanation for why opposition parties are struggling in Japan to unseat the government. Okay, so I just did this, like I'm working on my second book right now, and I'm working on a party tree, and I've had some help from a fantastic RA. So this is not all me, but this is sort of what Japan's party system has looked like. It's kind of a mess. So at the top here, you've got the LDP, which has just been in power from sort of 1955 onwards. And so it's had some people have left it, some people have left it and those parties died, or those people came back. Over here, you've got the Komeito in red. But then here, there are all of these other, so the main opposition to the LDP was the DPJ for a while, and then the DPJ has split. So if you look at the middle of the party tree, and then you look on the right-hand side, these are all of the ways in which Japan's party system has changed since 2012, actually, only over the last 8 years. So the reason I'm showing you this is that this is sort of purely speculation. I don't have evidence yet to make this point, but I think some of these parties are trying to unseat, they're not aiming to create a second majority seeking party to unseat the LDP. They're actually trying to kind of replace the Komeito as a partner, as a coordination partner for the LDP. So I think a lot of other other politicians, they look at the LDP and the Komeito, and I'm like, wow, like you've really sort of solidified this coordination in a way that helps you win elections. And so maybe we could do the same thing, but then so I think they're either sort of trying to come up with coordination that they can do themselves, or some of the more conservative aligned parties are thinking that maybe they could unseat the Komeito and be a potential partner for the LDP. So this is why I made this last point. I think this is a sort of new explanation for why opposition parties are struggling to unseat the LDP, Komeito juggernaut. More general takeaways. The project, it is pitched as a general project and a project of interest to political scientists. We make the claim that MMM makes pre-electoral coordination both desirable and possible, which is an important fact to note because 30 countries around the world use MMM. And then we say that when governing parties reliant on coordination have access to geographically targetable funds, they're going to be tempted to use those funds to try and cement this coordination. And if they do, opposition parties may be severely disadvantaged. Now, opposition parties are disadvantaged under a whole range of electoral systems, but we want to think more carefully about like how disadvantaged are they under MMM relative to other systems. So what's next? Well, we have a lot of research questions in front of us. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we want to study. So first of all, we want to look at other countries using MMM. We want to know, are governing parties doing this in other countries using MMM? There are another 28 countries, and we want to look at them. So how does MMM stack up against other electoral systems and the advantages that it confers on ruling parties? I just mentioned that. And then we want to look at this question of why does coordination not always work? So in 2009, it didn't work. The DPJ won. It won a huge majority of seats, and the LDP and the Komeito lost. So only election the LDP has ever not won a plurality in. So something went wrong prior to 2009, and we have some theories about what happened, but we want to look at that more closely. And then the other area of interest for me, given my former interest in national security, is I'm interested in how these payments, this pork barreling may be impacting negotiations over policies within the coalition. So the LDP has passed policies recently that are unpalatable to the Komeito, to put it mildly. So the LDP revised the interpretation of the Constitution that Japan could no longer, could not exercise collective self-defense. They decided that under certain conditions, Japan could exercise collective self-defense. This is sort of viewed by Japanese politics scholars as sort of the Komeito's capitulation. This policy was unpalatable to the Komeito, so why did they acquiesce to this policy? Although I will caution and say it is possible that that was already watered down substantially. The LDP actually wanted to do a lot more. They actually wanted to revise the Constitution, for example, and these things have been watered down by the Komeito. But I want to look at the relationship between this pork barreling to the Komeito SSDs, to Komeito supporters in Komeito SSDs, and look at whether that is somehow buying their acquiescence to these national security and other policies that the Komeito doesn't like. So that's another, I think, exciting area of interest that I have. Okay, so I will stop there and thank you all very much. To find out more about my research, you can just Google me, and my co-author Lucia has a lot of exciting research as well, and please feel free to look her up as well. She had a hand in every part of this project. Okay, so thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a very fascinating talk. So we already have actually a lot of questions. And so let me start with the questions from non-political scientists. There are three people, three apparently non-political scientists are asking questions. So let me ask you sort of those questions like at once, and you can sort of select some of those, or you can answer all of them. So I think first question asked is sort of, could you explain a little more specifics about this pork barrel politics part? So what exactly those spending are used, or how, so what, what kind of money they are. I mean, I guess that's the question. I think it's because it's related to sort of how this money can convince the supporters of those parties to sort of behave the way the parties want. So that's, I think, the first question. The second question. You can answer one by one.
Would you mind? I think it might be.
I don't mind. Go ahead. Sorry, please.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Pork barrel politics typically means money for a community that once you've spent it on that community, you can't spend it on other communities. But once you've spent it on that community, you don't restrict its access. Like, everyone in that community has access for it. So once you spend it on a community, everyone in that community has access to whatever you've bought with the money. But because you only have a finite amount of resources, if you spend money on one community, you're denying it to another community. So in this case, the Kopko-Shishitsken that we look at, it's projects that municipalities have applied to the central government. Now, these projects could be building a new library, beautifying train stations, surrounding areas, doing land reclamation, making a harbour look prettier. It also has been used for schooling as well. So there's like a huge variety of projects that the money municipalities apply. I wish I had some examples of the application process, like the way in which they put together proposals. It can be for roads, making roads better. So they come up with project ideas, they pitch the central government, and that's where the LDP politicians or the governing party politicians come in. The municipalities get the politicians to accompany them to meetings with bureaucrats in which they explain the merits of the various projects, and then the bureaucrats decide which ones are going to be funded and which ones aren't going to be funded. So I think in Japan, the understanding of pork barrel politics is pork barreling is similar to in the United States. It's projects for the community, which once built, reduce the amount of money available to other communities.
Great. Thanks. So I think on this sort of pork barrel thing related to this thing. So how can those money convince the supporters? Alison Alexi, a member of CJS, is asking, do party operatives understand what you've just explained? So to what degree are people within parties at any level aware of these trends in which they participate?
So that is a very good question. I have done some interviews. So unfortunately, I have not done interviews sort of over the last year. There's been something going on in the world which has prevented me from, and all of us really, from traveling. But I did do some interviews with Japanese politicians and their secretaries about 3 years ago, and I asked them about funds, like how they prioritize, like which municipalities projects to lobby for and which municipalities projects not to lobby for. And they got very cagey about that. And sometimes it's not, because it's not very, if a politician withholds government money from places that don't support the politician, it's not really how democracy is supposed to work. It's supposed to be the opposite. It's supposed to be individual groups holding government accountable. So I'm not really thinking that interviews are going to get me a lot of leverage over this question. I don't think politicians are going to be as forthright, although I am interested in showing them. So showing some of the politicians that I've done lots of interviews with and spent lots of time with, I'm interested in showing them the results and seeing what they say. But I don't think they're going to be as forthright when it comes to the securing of the funds. However, a politician that I spent a lot of time with in the 2009 election was actually one of the LDP politicians who kickstarted this idea of coordinating with the Komeito. His name is Mihara Asahiko. He's from Fukuoka. I spent a lot of time with him, and he told me about how he came up with this idea of he coordinated with the local Komeito organization, and he gave the Komeito organization his list of supporters and all their names and addresses and telephone numbers. And he gave them permission to go around saying, I got your address from Mihara Asahiko, and I would like you to vote for me, the Komeito in PR. So I had these stories, and this was before I embarked on this research project. So I didn't ask all the right questions that I would ask now, but this is something I observed in 2009. And his account has been written up in the newspaper, and this is not just based on my interview with him. But anyway, I would like to go to Japan once COVID is over to investigate this further.
Right. So I think, you know, as you said, the democracy is supposed to be such system that the voters are making politicians accountable for them, not the opposite. And I think, you know, I think this question is sort of having such a sentiment that, you know, against your sort of description of the situation, which says, like, how is pre-election coordination not illegal? It seems very Japanese in culture, but isn't this borderline collusion?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some countries, so actually pre-electoral coordination happens, but there are some systems, say like Great Britain, which has single seat districts only. In those systems, large parties, they still have this drive, they want to coordinate with a small party, but small parties don't exist. So we do think that MMM systems sort of generate this unique, like this demand for it because there are single seat districts, but also supply because there are small parties that exist and because of the PR tier. So we think it's not a uniquely Japanese thing. We know it happens in Mexico because we also look at Mexico. But just to answer your question, in Mexico, there are some rules. The government has passed rules about pre-electoral coordination. So that suggests that, so there are these rules that say, if a party coordinates at the national level with another party, it has to also coordinate at the same level going down at the lower tiers of elections, so like local elections. And so that is interesting. So maybe I should think more about whether there are rules about it and why these rules don't exist in the case of Japan.
Interesting. So thanks. So I think now we have several questions from political scientists and economists. One is from John Campbell. This is, well, I will read it out. So this is the most impressive statistical analysis of Japanese electoral politics I have ever seen. A minor question: roughly how much money is involved in the payoff? As a percent of the municipality budget, for example, how cheap a date are they?
How cheap? Cheap are they? It's good. That's a good question. That's a nice, good, well posed question. So, according to data from 2016, the NTD transfers represent about 15% of the average municipality's budget. So that's quite a large percent given that that's allocated entirely at the discretion of bureaucrats. And then I think another 15 to 18% of a municipality's budget comes from another form of transfer, this need-based transfer called local allocation tax. Chihou Kofuze is that one. So on average, government transfers account for between 30 to 35% of the average municipality's budget, and about half of that's from NTD, the one that we're looking at. So I am sort of in the process of collecting, I'm in the process of collecting data on like what I'm interested in just globally and the democracies around the world, how much, like Japanese municipalities are obviously very dependent on the government, but like how much of the government's money, large S, is able to just be allocated at the discretion of bureaucrats with no rules governing it. Because that's essentially the case with Kokoshishitsuken. And I want to look at this cross-nationally to see sort of how much, like how common this is. Because it could be the case that in Japan, these conditions, the amount of money they have access to, combined with the fact that votes are counted and reported at the level of the municipality, they could be creating sort of very They could be creating conditions that are really perfect, which you can conditions under which you can target funds to maximize your electoral chances, and that could explain why the LDP is so dominant. This is sort of a subject I'm working on in my second book right now.
Great.
But thank you for your comment, John. I wish I could see you and say thank you.
Okay, so next question is from Charlotte Cavalier of Ford School, I think. This is really interesting. This is likely not driven by voters with expressive ideological motives. Is there evidence that this type of voters is less prevalent in Japan? So the ideologically motivated voters are less prevalent in Japan. Also, is there qualitative evidence from elite interview to corroborate your findings, or are these arrangements very secretive? So that the second part is kind of you already sort of answered, but the first part of the question, if you could say something.
Yeah, so thank you, Charlotte, for asking those questions. So we think the money operates through LDP supporters. So LDP supporters, we think, are primarily motivated by getting goods for their communities, because a lot of these LDP supporters are actually local politicians. Local politicians, because the municipalities are so dependent on the central government, these local politicians are also dependent on getting money for their constituents on the central government. So local politicians in Japan, an extremely large percentage of local politicians are affiliated with the LDP, and they make up the group of LDP supporters. So we think this group is primarily motivated by pork barrel. How big this group is in every municipality varies, but I think it's a sort of not more than a third of voters. Then you have all the other voters, which I think are motivated by programmatic policies and sort of ideologies of political parties. But what we are trying to show here, what we think is happening, and we think this is sort of an early stab at what's going on, is that through this coordination, the LDP can kind of just get enough votes to win so many seats. And so all of those voters that care about ideology and programmatic policies are kind of paid lip service to, and there may be a couple of programmatic policies passed each time that the LDP does to kind of placate them. But they're primarily like the people who get the party supported, the people who get the coalition supported, the people who get the coalition who get them to win the elections are motivated by pork barreling. But that's not the case for like the average Japanese voter. I think the average Japanese voter thinks about the things that they think about the community, sure, but they also think about these like programmatic issues that the political parties have taken stances on.
Great, thanks. So I actually had a question, which is that, like, why Komeito, not other parties? But I guess that part sort of explains some part of this question, because you need the small parties voters to be sort of motivated by polls more than ideology, I guess. So that's I guess what do you sort of say about this point? Or?
So actually, I hadn't thought about that angle, but that is also true. Yes, what you said is also the case. But the second thing is I would say is the LDP's candidates. So when they reformed the electoral system in 1994, the LDP was left with a lot of candidates who could place first in rural areas, but not enough candidates who could place first in the urban areas. And the Komeito has traditionally been a party that was strong in urban areas. So the Komeito, okay, so number one, it has very dedicated groups of supporters that are they really roll out, they really know how to get out the vote in elections, right? Komeito supporters are really good at that. So first of all, they're very good at that. And there's also been a history of Komeito, like in the 80s and the early 90s at least, in coordinating with other parties. So the Komeito, they have these supporters, loyal groups of supporters. They have a history of coordination, plus they had support bases that were stronger in exactly those areas where the LDP support base was weaker. So I think that's why the LDP chose the Komeito. And the LDP really chose the Komeito. It was in another coalition at the time. It was like, we don't like you, the Liberals, we're going to choose the Komeito. And it's been so durable because I think partly of the complementarity of the support base, the other reason that you mentioned may also be a factor. The Komeito, or maybe they are ideologically motivated, but maybe they're getting what they need from the coalition, and then they're also getting pork barrel projects for their communities.
Thanks. Okay, so we still have a lot of questions, so maybe I should. Next question is, what would be the reasons you picked to measure on PR vote rather than measuring vote increase in SMD? That is a question. Relatedly, I also have a question. Why ignore upper house? Because oftentimes it seems that a loss of upper house election often leads to resignation of the prime minister, especially sort of after Koizumi administration. So I'm curious, I'm curious the implication of your sort of exclusive focus on the lower house.
So that is primarily, we've only first looked at the lower house, but we think this, in fact, we know because there's a lot of newspaper articles about coordination in upper house elections. So this is absolutely happening as well. And if there are any students out there listening to my talk who want to come and study with me at New York University and help me look at the upper house elections, I would love to do that with you. I'd also like to do that, by myself, but I just have a lot of interesting sort of areas that I want to get into. But yes, I would love to look at this upper house, and I think that is happening there as well.
What about PR vote instead of SMD?
Yeah, so I guess what this person is saying is there's also coordination in the SSD. Like if the LDP candidate is running, the Komeito supporters are voting for that candidate. So why do we not look at that as well as the PR votes? And I think it's mostly because we initially began so the LDP and the Komeito, they pretty much divvied out the SSDs like very early on in the coordination. And so we don't have a lot of changes. Like if we had the LDP candidate deciding to stand down in one election in favor of the Komeito candidate, if we had more variation in that, we could look at changes in votes for the SSD candidates, but we don't have that. They pretty much decided on the SSDs early on, and that's why in the analysis we focus on the PR votes. That's the main reason, but I am interested in ideas for how to tease out the coordination in the SSD votes as well.
Great. Okay, so next question is from Josh Hausman, again at the Ford School as well. If it's not too late, it's not too late yet. And I was wondering to what extent the LDP staying power for so long is due to a lack of more flexible ideological commitments. My sense is that in the US, for example, no party would stay in power for too long, because if it was winning large majorities, it would spend its political capital on unpopular policies that the party's base were committed to. So arguably, we see this now with the Republicans using a persistent Senate majority to confirm unpopular Supreme Court justices. Does this dynamic not apply to the LDP in Japan because it has less of a base with strong ideological commitments?
So in Japan, the corollary to this is that the LDP's pork barreling can get out of control, to put it in a nutshell. So maybe they don't get ideologically too committed to far right or far left policy, but their pork barreling can get out of control when they're in power for a long time. And that's because individual LDP politicians are like, yeah, we have the money to do this and this and this, and they just do too many things. So I guess my answer is that I think the LDP, the pork barreling got out of control, and that is part of the reason why the LDP lost power between 1993 and 94, and that caused the electoral system to be reformed. And then the pork barreling, I was just going to say because the LDP also lost in 2009. And so maybe had the LDP lost in 2009, the pork barreling would have gotten just kind of more and more and more. And then eventually it could have spiraled out of control. But while they were in the opposition, they really licked their wounds and figured out like what was going wrong and changed themselves. They did a lot of things. Party leaders took, like the leadership took people's temperature on different policy areas and like what people, it's to kind of prevent splits in the party. Then they came roaring back in 2012. But I think the answer really is more to do with the power the leader has over party members. So in a country like the United States, the leaders may have more power to make policies. So maybe the leaders are the people who would kind of over time lead the party more and more and more to an ideological extreme position. But in Japan, leaders, I think, still have less power. And so individual politicians just kind of pork barreling. So yeah, this is kind of my answer is going on. I'm going to think about this, and it's an interesting question. And I'm not really sure why the LDP is not, become so complacent. Although I look at the LDP's policies, I think they have become very complacent. A lot of their policies are not supported by a majority of the people.
Right. Well, it's a little difficult to think about sort of very ideological policy issue in Japan. To be honest, I mean there are some, but those are probably not like pro-choice, pro-life divide in the U.S. or like gun control issues in the U.S. Like, I guess like no policy issues in Japan are in any way similar to the harsh divide in the U.S. I think. Okay, so we still have questions. So let me ask you more questions. So since the Komeito and the LDP are both central right and conservative power, to what extent are they different from each other? If they are different and Komeito's supporters are identified with Komeito's policy advocate, how can they be persuaded to vote for the LDP? I guess that's, like similar question from a different phrasing. In this sense, can we say Komeito politicians are the LDP's brokers?
Interesting.
This is from a PhD student in the policy department.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting idea. Obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, but I think they are getting bought through the pork barreling. They get to be in government, so they get some policies that they like. So, for example, there was a dispute over policies to mitigate against damage from COVID to businesses. The Komeito got what it wanted there. It got a kind of blanket payout to everyone. So the Komeito can get some of its policies passed by being in government, having its leverage over the LDP. So if you think about it, the Komeito actually has a lot of leverage because they have all these votes in all of these districts that these LDP politicians depend on. So Japanese politics scholars talk about why is the Komeito in the coalition with the LDP, because it's diametrically opposed ideologically and the LDP does things the Komeito doesn't like. But it is possible that the LDP have already watered down a lot of the policies that they would be passing in advance or in sort of anticipation of what the Komeito would prefer. So it's possible that the Komeito is getting more than we realize from the coalition because it has this leverage. But the idea that the Komeito have been converted to sort of just brokers for the party, that's also consistent, I think, with some of the findings. So without knowing more about the policies that the two partners want and have passed, it's difficult for me to say whether that's correct or not, but it could be correct.
Okay, so next question is, I'm curious to know how Japanese voters view third parties. I think it means third meaning in SMD, third parties. Do you see movements that are encouraging voters to at least consider the positions of third parties as legitimate? is there developing disillusionment with the two major parties as one may see in the United States? This is a question from master's student at the Center for Russian and East European Studies.
Yeah, well, thank you for this question too. So third parties in Japan, because there's the PR tier, they're not sort of seen as sort of crazy or voters don't have a negative impression of third parties per se. I do think they have a negative impression of all of the changes in the opposition, like the attempts to build after the DPJ sort of successfully failed between 2009 and 2012. And the DPJ started to collapse in 2012, and it was sort of a long, drawn-out process. I think voters would kind of liked it when there's a second majority-seeking party. But in general, voters I don't think they look askance at small parties per se, because they're going to exist because there's a PR tier. And when you have a proportional representation tier, you have small parties. Did that answer the question? Is there something I'm missing?
I think.
But in single seat districts over the last 8 years, especially in the 2012 election, when third parties ran in the single seat districts, they typically divided the non-LDP vote, and that helped LDP people win. So that's something that also may make voters, and speaking to your point, voters who do not support the LDP may be frustrated that third party candidates are running and dividing up the vote, helping the LDP candidates win.
All right, so we are close to the end. So this is probably the last question I can ask. Thank you for sharing your fascinating research. To what degree do you believe the rules concerning pre-electoral coordination impacted elections in Mexico? I'm not sure if you have enough material to answer this question, but if you can say something, that would be great.
Sure. We have the same analyses conducted on Mexico. So Mexico, the PRI, when it controlled the Chamber of Deputies, when it was in control of the Chamber of Deputies, it coordinated with a smaller party called the PVEM. And what they did over there, it's very interesting in Mexico, because in Mexico you have MMM, but you only have one vote. So unlike Japan, you only have one vote. So the conventional wisdom is there's no coordination because you just have one vote. So you can't cast, one vote for one party, one vote for the other party. So what our research discovers about the case of Mexico is that governing parties, the PRI and the PVM, they found a way to convert one vote to two components, one that could be cast for one party and one that could be cast for the coordinating party. So the way they did this is they got together with the PRI and the PVM. It divided up the SSDs into alliance SSDs and then non-alliance SSDs. Now, in the alliance SSDs, what they do is they run joint candidates. So they run the same SSD candidate with the other party, just one candidate, but the candidate appears twice on the ballot, once under the PRI and once under the PVEM. So when you do that, you can assign the candidacy. The joint candidate can be one party, but you can ask the supporters to vote for that candidate under the other party's label. And that means that one vote is going to one party and the other vote is going to the other party. So we explain that in the case of Mexico, and that's very new for the literature. We explain that in the case of Mexico, and then we show that in alliance SSDs where PVM candidates are running, PVM supporters are encouraged to switch their votes to vote for the joint candidate who's a PVM candidate under the PRI's label to make sure that second component of the vote goes to the PVM, to the PRI. Anyway, so we have a whole, and that's original data. No one's ever used that data before. And I encourage people to read the paper, which is on my website. The paper is called Geographically Targeted Spending Under Mixed Member Majoritarian Electoral Systems, and it explains all of this.
Great. Thank you very much. There are still questions on the queue, but this is we have to stop here. And thank you very much for giving the talk, Amy. It was really great and fascinating and thought-provoking.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you on behalf of other people here. And this is the end of today's CJS noon lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.